President.
The senior senator from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I understand we're not in a quorum call right now.
Senator is correct.
All right. I ask the minister's consent that I be recognized for 10 minutes as if in morning business. Mr. President, I introduced a bill, S-1085, this morning. And I have some co-sponsors, including Senator Snowe from Maine. And it addresses something that's become very controversial. It's certainly not partisan in any way. It's more geographical. And that is, I have been one who has been opposed to the corn ethanol mandates ever since they first came out. I opposed the 2007 energy bill because it doubled the corn-based ethanol mandates, despite the mounting questions surrounding ethanol's compatibility with existing engines, its environmental sustainment, as well as transportation infrastructure needs. You know, I can remember back when they first did it, all the environmentalists were saying corn ethanol is going to be the answer. We need to, they're all for it, but they're against it now. They all recognize that corn ethanol is bad for the environment. Now, the three areas that we have, I personally have a problem is, number one, the environment. Number two, you have a compatibility situation. You talk to any of the farmers, any of the marine people, and they'll tell you that it's very destructive to the small engines. And thirdly, everyone's concerned with the high price of fuel, with the fact that corn ethanol is not good for your mileage. Chris Kaiser of the Outdoor Power Equipment Manufacturers testified before the Environment Public Works Committee on ethanol's compatibility or lack of compatibility with more than 200 million legacy engines across America, which aren't designed to run on certain blends of ethanol. And I'll quote her testimony before our committee now. She said, in the marine industry, if your machine fails and your engine fails and you're 30 miles offshore, it's a serious problem. Or if you're in a snow machine and it fails in the wilderness, it's a serious problem. Consumers complain about the decreasing fuel efficiency, and corn ethanol contains 67% of the BTU of gasoline. We call it clear gas, anything that doesn't have any. And by the way, this is a good time to say we're not talking about biomass. We're only talking about corn ethanol. Another problem that I have in my state of Oklahoma is we're a big cattle state, and that has driven the cost of feedstock up to a level that's not acceptable. According to the EPA, vehicles operating on E85 ethanol experience a 20 to 30% drop in miles per gallon due to ethanol's lower energy content. The Consumer Reports found that E85 resulted in a 27% drop in fuel. Now, as a result of all of this, you drive around Oklahoma. First of all, we're here in Washington. It's my understanding there is no choice in Washington or Virginia or Maryland and those areas. In my state of Oklahoma, we still have a choice. And the choice is very clear of the people in my state of Oklahoma. The problem is, the way this is set up, we will run into a barrier where they will no longer have clear gas available in the current formulas. And for that reason, we have people who, at almost every station you see, or the majority of the stations in Oklahoma, you have signs like this. Put up the other signs here, and then, oh, do you have two or three of those? Yeah, here it is. All right, let's just leave that one up. Ethanol free, 100% gas. This is all over my state of Oklahoma. Well, there's a solution to this problem, and it's one that I have introduced in this bill. And but before describing that, I think the most pressing issue of the so-called blend wall is the ESA mandated 15 billion gallons of corn-based ethanol by 2015. But today it's readily apparent that the country can't physically absorb this much corn ethanol. It's just too much, too fast. In Oklahoma, ethanol's blend wall has nearly eliminated consumer choice. The fuel blenders and gas station owners have little option but to sell ethanol-blended gasoline despite strong consumer demand for clear gas. There's the consumer demand all over my state of Oklahoma. So what's the solution? I introduced a very simple 5-page bill. The bill would allow individual states to opt out of the mandate. Now, it would require that their state legislature wants this and that they pass a resolution that's signed by the governor, and they would be able to opt out. The state would pass a bill, it's signed by the governor, stating its election to exercise this option. The administrator of the EPA would then reduce the amount of the national corn ethanol mandate by the percentage amount of gasoline consumed by that state. And this option of non-participation would only apply to the corn portion of the RFS and would not affect any of the volumetric requirements of advanced biofuels. We're big in advanced biofuels in my state of Oklahoma. The various foundations, Oklahoma State University, we have switchgrass we're working on, and it's something that we're all for. The bill actually redefines cellulosic biofuels as next-generation biofuel. The previous defined cellulosic biofuel carved out is expanded to include algae and other non-ethanol renewable fuels derived from renewable biomass. So this is something that is not going to be incompatible. It's going to be very compatible with what we with our interests here. So anyway, for those people who say, well, you know, we demand to have corn-based ethanol, that's fine. You can have it. Because all this is choice. And if we and the people in my state of Oklahoma want to have a choice of clear gas or corn ethanol, they should be able to do it. I honestly don't think there's a legitimate argument against that. So I plan to try to get some co-sponsors. I think my good friend from Florida might be interested in co-sponsoring something like this, because this gives choice to the people of his state as well as my state. Now, with that, I just want to mention one other thing, if I could. Mr. President, you can go ahead and take that down if you want to. I've made 4 speeches on the floor in the last month about the disaster, the catastrophe that's taken place in a country in West Africa called Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire is a country that was the president, the legitimate president, I might add, is Laurent Gbagbo and his wife Simone. Someone named Alassane Ouattara from the northern part of Côte d'Ivoire, it was with a rigged election, came in, and that was certified, and it was all set up before we knew what was going on. And that individual, his name is Ouattara, he has his death squads today, this very moment, as we speak, are roaming the streets of Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire. And he's murdering and he's raping. Right now they have in captivity Laurent Gbagbo, the legitimate president of Côte d'Ivoire. I think they're in the process of perhaps killing him right now. We don't know that. The State Department doesn't know that. No one knows it. We had a hearing. The State Department was totally without any kind of compassion or concern over what's happening in the streets of Abidjan. We witnessed on video of the helicopters coming through and destroying that city. And as we have friends there right now who tell us that even today, the death squads of Alassane Ouattara are roaming the streets murdering people. No one can say within 10,000 people how many people they've murdered. But my concern is this. It's too late to do anything about that. They rigged the election. I documented it. I sent the documentation to the State Department. They paid no attention to it. France was behind the whole thing. France wants to have as much control as they can in West Africa, obviously. They somehow conned the United Nations into it, and of course our State Department went along with it. Well, what's happening right now is so inhumane. It's impossible for me. I wish I had the pictures that I showed before. The beautiful First Lady, Simone Gbagbo, is a beautiful lady, and they took her into captivity, pulled her hair out by the roots, and ran through the streets of Abidjan holding her hair up in their hands. And they're murdering everyone who is a friend of that administration. Well, I have one plea right now. They're considering that now. They're trying to consider some way that make it look like suicide. I don't know what they're doing. State Department doesn't know what they're doing. Unfortunately, the State Department doesn't even care what they're doing. Well, one of the options would be to allow the President and the First Lady and some who are close to go to another country in sub-Saharan Africa and be able to stay in that country. We have already located host countries to allow this to take place. So I'm just making an appeal right now. I can't get the Secretary of State to talk to me about it. I can't get anyone else, just a handful of people. But we need to do something, and do something now, today. If we wait till after this recess, I would almost say the blood will be on the hands of the State Department, because we can do something about it now. All we have to do is encourage the new illegitimately elected president of Côte d'Ivoire. His name is Alassane Ouattara. Encourage him and his administration to give an opportunity for another state to host these two individuals. Quite frankly, I think that would be a very smart thing politically for him to do, because the other two options we all know what happens. We know what martyrs are, and that's what would happen. So this is an appeal, I guess a final appeal to anyone who's sensitive to the torturing and the raping and the murdering that's going on today, to join me in encouraging the State Department, the United Nations, and France, and Alassane Ouattara to turn over President and Mrs. Gbagbo to a host country for their asylum. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President. The senior senator from Florida is recognized.
Mr. President, I have 10 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of both the majority and the minority leaders, so I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President. Mr. President, you've heard the phrase, Madam President, you've heard the phrase, drill, baby, drill. Well, it's interesting. That seems to be the pro-oil company folks that think that all of our answers are having to do with drilling. Well, lo and behold, you know what, Madam President, we've actually increased our domestic production. And I quote from a Reuters story on May 25th, crude oil production, especially in the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico, increased by 334,000 barrels per day between 2005 and 2010, which also cut into foreign oil purchases. As a matter of fact, the article goes on to say that imports of crude and petroleum products accounted for 49.3% of the U.S. oil demand last year, down from the high of 60.3% in 2005. It also marked the first time since 1997 that America's foreign oil addiction fell under the 50% threshold. Now that's worth noting. That's really something, because the trend is reversing. Maybe it's that we're getting more energy conscious. Maybe it's that we're spending less gasoline in our vehicles because we're getting higher miles per gallon standards. Maybe we're remembering to turn off the lights when we leave the room. Maybe we're being a lot more sensitive to how vulnerable we are when we depend, as we have in the past, upwards of 60 and 70% of our daily consumption coming from foreign shores, places like Nigeria and the Persian Gulf and Venezuela, and now I have just named 3 very unstable parts of the world that at any moment that production could be cut off. And so maybe America is finally waking up to the fact that, lo and behold, we've got to be concerned about our energy sources and don't depend so much on foreign production. But the question raised by the mantra, drill, baby, drill, is not the answer. The question raised by drill, baby, drill implies that if you just continue to drill in places where we can drill domestically, that's going to solve our problem. That ignores the fact that to take an oil field and get it into production is usually about 10 years. That doesn't solve our problem now as we are facing these high gas prices, and that's what I want to talk about, is the high gas prices. It does say that we ought to drill where we should, and, Madam President, a lot of people do not know that of the 37 million acres that are leased in the Gulf of Mexico, only 7 million of the 37 million are drilled. There are 37 million acres leased in the Gulf of Mexico, but only 7 million of those 37 million acres are drilled. So let's drill, baby, drill. Let's drill on all those leases, those 30 million acres in the Gulf and elsewhere that are existing leases that haven't been drilled. So, but you know, it's not this world oil market that the United States consumption is causing these gas prices to go up. There are other factors, and that's what I want to talk about. Now, it's true that there are new demands on oil consumption from burgeoning countries like China and India, and that causes more oil to be consumed from the world marketplace. Remember what I just cited, that the U.S. is lowering its consumption of the imported oil. So that's clearly not a factor that is affecting the price of oil worldwide or the price at the pump that we pay, which is the refined gasoline. No, there's another reason. And that reason happens to be that there are speculators out there running around, running the price up on commodities exchanges for oil futures contracts. And those prices run up until they're ready to dump them, and suddenly they go down. Now, I want to call to the attention of the Senate. This is a New York Times story from May 24th, a couple days ago, entitled, U.S. Suit Sees Manipulation of Oil Trades. The suit says that in early 2008, they tried to hoard nearly two-thirds of the available supply of the crucial American market for crude oil, and then abruptly dumped it and improperly pocketed $50 million. Federal commodities regulators filed a civil lawsuit against two obscure traders in Australia and California and three American and international firms. And this was in the context 3 years ago, in 2008, when oil prices had surged past $100 a barrel. There were those suspicions then that traders had manipulated the market, and that ultimately has led to a number of commentary and investigations. Well, the regulators at the Commodities Futures Trading Commission have now filed this suit, and they're looking into the fraud being utilized in these oil and gas markets, particularly the commodities futures markets. In the past months, I have come to this floor several times to discuss the net result of all of this, which is what we pay at the pump and how it directly links to these oil speculators and the game they play in running up the price of oil. Using this data from the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and price data from the Energy Information Administration, we have shown on this floor in speech after speech until I'm blue in the face, we have demonstrated the direct link between the rising level of speculators and their speculation in our energy markets and the skyrocketing oil and gas prices. And so, when the top executives of the 5 largest oil companies in the U.S. testified a week ago in our Senate Finance Committee, I asked them on what role speculation played in the oil markets. And I asked them, please explain why gas prices are remaining so high when oil prices had begun to fall. Well, you should have heard the mumbling around. The truth is that speculators, whether they are active traders or passive investors, have hijacked our oil markets, and they've done this in recent years, and the American people are the ones that are suffering the consequences because the price of that gas goes up when we pump it into our cars. Oil prices are set in futures markets, such as those regulated by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Future contracts, and that is you buy a contract of oil at a specified price to be delivered at a future date. Those futures contracts allow oil producers to lock in prices on their future output. And those contracts also allow large consumers of fuel, like airlines, to lock in a price as a hedge against inflation and that future price swinging way up. Well, the futures markets were intended to bring actual producers and real consumers of oil together. And in doing so, the supply would match the demand. Speculators then were allowed to play a limited role to ensure that there was sufficient liquidity in the market. But then, here's what happens, and this is what happened back in 2008 when the price of gas went so high. Speculators constitute now anywhere from 2/3 to 80% of the market. They're no longer a bit player. They are the main player. And this is what we need to end. In last year's financial reform bill, we directed the Commodity Futures Trading Commission to set hard limits on the speculative positions. We gave them a deadline of last January the 21st. Now we're here months past the deadline, but the CFTC has not yet finalized a rule. Now, why should they do this? Well, if you're a legitimate user of oil, say an airline, you have every reason to want to hedge against the price of that oil going way up. So you buy a contract for delivery of oil at a specified price at a future date. But if you are a speculator who buying and selling oil futures contracts having no intention to use the oil, having only to put as a down payment a bare percentage of the total contract price, you can manipulate that price upwards by buying and selling those contracts. This is exactly what happened back in 2008. It's what's happening again as we've seen the price of a barrel of oil go up and up. Now, we passed the law last year. The Commission has the authority. We shouldn't have to pass another law that requires them to do it. But, Madam President, if the CFTC cannot get the job done, then we're going to have to. And that's the bottom line. The American people are outraged. Here, America is lowering its consumption of oil. Here, America is lowering its imports of oil. Here, we are getting more energy conscious, and yet the price of gas keeps going up. It's time to put an end to this. Madam President, I yield the floor. And I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The senator from Arizona.
In a few minutes, my colleague from Maryland, Senator Cardin, will be introducing a bill which I am a co-sponsor along with a large bipartisan group of our colleagues will be introducing. And I want to emphasize at the outset that some may characterize this legislation as anti-Russian. In fact, I believe it is pro-Russian. It's pro the people of Russia. It's pro the people that stand up for human rights and democracy in that country, which unfortunately seems to be sadly deprived of. This legislation, as my colleague and friend Senator Cardin will describe, requires the Secretary of State, in consultation with the Secretary of Treasury, to publish a list of each person that our government has reason to believe was responsible for the detention, abuse, or death of Sergei Magnitsky, participated in efforts to conceal the legal liability for these crimes, committed those acts of fraud that Magnitsky uncovered, is responsible for extrajudicial killings, torture, or other gross violations of human rights committed against individuals seeking to expose illegal activities in Russia or exercise other universally recognized human rights. Second, the individuals on that list would become the target of an array of penalties, among them ineligibility to receive a visa to travel. They'd have their current visas revoked. Their assets would be frozen that are under U.S. jurisdiction, and U.S. financial institutions would be required to audit themselves to ensure that none of these individuals are able to bank, access funds, and move money in the U.S. financial system. I guess the first question that many people will be asking is, who was Sergei Magnitsky? Who was this individual that has aroused such outrage and anger throughout the world? He was a tax attorney. He was a tax attorney working for an international company called Hermitage Capital that had invested in Russia. He didn't spend his life as a human rights activist or an outspoken critic of the Russian government. He was an ordinary man, but he became an extraordinary champion of justice, fairness, and the rule of law in a Russia where those principles, frankly, have lost meaning. What Sergei Magnitsky did was he uncovered a collection of Russian government officials and criminals that were associated with the Russian government officials, colluded to defraud the Russian state of $230 million. The Russian government, in turn, blamed the crime on Heritage Capital and threw Magnitsky in prison in 2008. Magnitsky was detained for 11 months without trial. Russian officials, especially from the Interior Ministry, pressured Magnitsky to deny what he had uncovered, to lie and recant. He refused. He was sickened by what his government had done, and he refused to surrender principle to brute power. As a result, he was transferred to increasingly more severe and more horrific prison conditions. He was forced to eat unclean food and water. He was denied basic medical care as his health worsened. In fact, he was placed in an even worse conditions until on November 16, 2009, having served 358 days in prison, Sergei Magnitsky died. He was 37 years old. Sergei Magnitsky's torture and murder, let's call it what it really was, is but an extreme example of a problem that is unfortunately all too common and widespread in Russia today. The flagrant violations of the rule of law and basic human rights committed by the Russian government itself along with its allies. I note the presence of my colleague and lead sponsor of this important legislation, and I also hope that in his remarks that perhaps my friend from Maryland would mention the latest in the last few days was the affirmation of the incredible sentence on Mr. Mikhail Khodorkovsky and his associate, which is in many ways tantamount to a death sentence. Again, one of these blatant abuses of justice and an example of the corruption that exists at the highest level of government. I want to say again that I appreciate my colleague from Maryland's advocacy and steadfast efforts on behalf of human rights in Russia, Belarus, and other countries, and it's been a great honor to work with him and for him in bringing this important resolution to the floor of the Senate. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that at the appropriate time, the Senator from Maryland and I be allowed to engage in colloquy.
Without objection.
Yield.
The Senator from Maryland.
First, Madam President, if I might, I ask unanimous consent that floor privileges be temporarily granted to Kyle Parker, a staff member of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which I co-chaired during the pendency of this colloquy, which I am engaging with Senator McCain.
Without objection.
And let me just thank Senator McCain, not just for taking this time here for this colloquy concerning Mr. Magnitsky, but for his long-standing commitment to justice issues, human rights issues, and the values that the United States represents internationally. We've had a long, proud, bipartisan, and most importantly, successful record of promoting basic American values, such as democratic governance and the rule of law around the world. Engaging the countries of the Eastern Bloc on matters such as respect for human rights was critical to winning the Cold War. We will never know how many lives were improved and even saved due to the instruments such as the Helsinki Final Act and the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. These measures defined an era of human rights activism that ultimately pried open the Iron Curtain and brought down the wall. Thankfully, the Cold War is over, and we have a stronger relationship, both at the governmental and societal levels, with countries in Eastern Europe. But sadly, internationally recognized rights and freedoms continue to be trampled, and in many cases with absolute impunity. With the possibility of Russia's succession to the World Trade Organization and the presidents of the United States and Russia meeting in France, ours is a timely discussion. Just last week, I joined my distinguished colleague, the senator from Arizona, and 14 other senators from both parties to introduce the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act, a broad bill to address what the respected watchdog Transparency International dubbed a systematically corrupted country, and to create consequences for those who are currently getting away with murder. Mr. President, Madam President, actions always speak louder than words. The diplomatic manner of dealing with human rights abuses has frequently been so condemned by the abuser, often publicly, with the hope that these statements will be all they need to do. They say, oh, yes, we're against these human rights violations. We're for the rule of law. We're for people being able to come forward and tell us about problems and be able to correct things. They condemn the abusers, but they take no action. They think that their words will be enough. Well, we know differently. We know what's happening today in Russia. We know the tragedies of Sergei Magnitsky was not an isolated episode. It's not the only time this has happened. My colleague from Arizona mentioned the Khodorkovsky case. Mr. Khodorkovsky today is in prison with even a longer sentence. Why? Because he had the courage to stand up and say that there's a corrupt system in Russia and something should be done about it. That's why he's in prison, and that is wrong. So it's time that we do something about this, that we make it clear that action is needed. For too long, the leaders in Russia have said, we're going to investigate what happened to Sergei Magnitsky. We think it was terrible that he died in prison without getting adequate medical care. As Senator McCain pointed out, here's a person whose only crime was to bring to the proper attention of officials corruption, public corruption within Russia. As a result of his whistleblowing, he was arrested and thrown in jail and died in jail. He was tortured. And that cannot be allowed to just be said, oh, that's terrible. The people who are responsible, we know who they were. We know who they were. In some cases, they've been promoted in their public positions. Well, it's time for us to take action, and that's why we have introduced this legislation. While this bill goes far beyond the tragic experiences of Sergei Magnitsky, it does bear his name, so let me just refresh everyone with some of the circumstances concerning his death. And I mention this because some people might say, you know, why are we talking about one person? Let's talk about the isolated examples. But as the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin said, one death is a tragedy, 1 million is statistics. I rarely agree with dictator Stalin, but you've got to put a face on the issue. People have to understand that these are real people and real lives that have been ruined forever as a result of the abuses within Russia. Sergei was a skilled tax lawyer who was well known in Moscow among many Western companies, large and small. In fact, he even did some accounting for the National Conference on Soviet Jewry. Working at the American law firm of Firestone Duncan, Sergei uncovered the largest known tax fraud in modern Russian history and blew the whistle on the swindling of his fellow citizens by corrupt officials. And for that, he was promptly arrested by his subordinates of those he implicated in the crime. He was held in detention for nearly a year without trial or visits from family and under torturous conditions. He developed severe medical complications which went deliberately untreated and died on November 16, 2009, alone in an isolation cell while prison doctors waited outside his door. Sergei was 37 years old, left behind a wife, 2 sons, a dependent mother, and so many friends. Shortly after his death, Philip Pan, the Washington Post, wrote, and I quote, Magnitsky's complaints made public by his attorneys as he composed them went unanswered while he lived. But in a nation where millions perished in the Soviet gulags, the words of the 37-year-old tax lawyer struck a nerve after he died. His descriptions of the squalid conditions he endured have been splashed on the front pages of newspapers and discussed on radio and television across the country. Part of an outcry even his supporters never expected. End quote. I think Senator McCain and I would agree, you know, there's this thirst for democracy around the world. The people in Russia want more. They want freedom. They want accountability. They want honest government officials. And they're outraged by what happened to Sergei Magnitsky. I might just point out, just this past week, I met with a leader from the Russian business community who came here and traveled at some risk, I might say. Just visiting me was a risk. You know, we've had people from Russia who are being questioned because they come and talk to us. But he said to me that what happened here needs to be answered by the Russian authorities. And he understands why we have this legislation here. A year after his death, and with no one held accountable of those implicated, and some even promoted and decorated, The Economist noted, and I quote again, at the time, few people outside the small world of Russian investors and a few human rights activists had heard of Mr. Magnitsky. A year later, his death has become a symbol of the mind-boggling corruption and injustice perpetrated by the Russian system and the inability of the Kremlin to change it. Regrettably, we know that Sergei's case, egregious as it is not isolated. Human rights abuses continued unpunished and often unknown across Russia today. To make this point more clear, let me look at another example far outside the financial districts of Moscow and St. Petersburg in the North Caucasus in southern Russia, where Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov condones and oversees massive violations of human rights, including violations of religious freedom and rights of women. His militia also violates international humanitarian laws. Of this April, the European Court on Human Rights has ruled against Russia in 186 cases concerning Chechnya, mostly involving civilians. So, Madam President, Sergei Magnitsky's case is not an isolated case of an abuse by the Russian authorities. there's been a systematic effort made to deny people their basic human rights, including one individual, Natalia Estimirova, who personally visited my office at the Helsinki Commission. She was accused of being involved in murders of political opponents and has been abused in Russia. So it's time for Russia to take action, but we cannot wait. We need to take action.
Will the gentleman yield for
I yield back to my colleague.
Yield for a question. I'd ask my first again, thank you. I say to my colleague from Maryland for a very eloquent and I think very strong statement, which I can add very little to. But isn't it true, I'd ask my friend, that this Magnitsky case and Khodorkovsky, which I'd like for us to talk a little bit more about, is not an isolated incident? In other words, this is the face of the problem in Russia today. As you mentioned, in its annual Index of Perceptions of Corruption, Transparency International ranked Russia 154th out of 178 countries, perceived as more corrupt than Pakistan, Yemen, and Zimbabwe. The World Bank considers 122 countries to be better places to do business than Russia. One of these countries is Georgia, which the World Bank ranks as the 12th best country to do business. In other words, what happened isn't it true that in the Magnitsky case, it's what's been taking place all across Russia, including this incredible story of Khodorkovsky, who was one of the wealthiest men in Russia, one of the wealthiest oligarchs, who rebelled against this corruption because he saw the long-term consequences of this kind of corruption, and was brought to trial, convicted. Then, when his sentence was completed, they charged him again. And talk about a corrupt system. Isn't it true that Vladimir Putin said he should, quote, sit in jail? And we now know that the whole trial was rigged by, as revealed by people who were part of the whole trial? In other words, isn't it true, I'd ask my friend from Maryland, that what we're talking about here is one human tragedy, but it's a tragedy that's unfolding throughout Russia that we don't really have any knowledge of. And if we allow this kind of abuse to go on unresponded, then obviously we're abrogating our responsibilities to the world. Is that...
Senator McCain, you're absolutely right. This is not an isolated, Magnitsky is not an isolated case of a lawyer doing his job on behalf of a client being imprisoned, tortured, and killed by the authorities, and then the authorities promoted and not held accountable. We have a lot of examples of lawyers trying to do their jobs and being arrested and intimidated and their rights violated. But in Mr. Khodorkovsky's case, you have a business leader who was treated the same way just because he was a successful business leader. And even worse, he happened to be an opponent of the power in being. So we're now seeing in Russia where they want to quell opposition by arresting people who are just speaking their minds, doing their business legally, putting them in prison, trying them, and in the Khodorkovsky case, actually increasing their sentences the more they speak out against the regime. That's how totalitarian they want to be and how oppressive they are to human rights. But I could go further. If you're a journalist in Russia and you try to do any form of independent journalist, you're in danger of being beaten, being imprisoned, being murdered. It's very intimidating, and the list goes on and on and on.
So could I ask my colleague, what implications, if any, does the senator from Maryland feel should have on the Russian entry into the World Trade Organization?
Well, it's very interesting, Senator McCain. I just came from a Senate Finance Committee hearing, and we're talking about a free trade agreement, and I'm for free trade agreements. I think it makes sense. It's funny, when a country wants to do trade with the United States, they all of a sudden understand that they've got to look at their human rights issues. And I think all of us would like to see Russia part of the international trade community. I'd like to see Russia, which is already members of a lot of international organizations, live up to their commitments that they've made in joining these international organizations. But it's clear to me that Russia needs to reform. If we're going to have business leaders traveling to Russia in order to do business, I want to make sure they're safe in Russia. I want to make sure that they're going to get the protection of the rule of law in Russia. I want to make sure that there's basic rights that the business people in Russia and the United States can depend upon. So, yes, I understand that Russia would like to get into the WTO, and we have, of course, the Jackson-Vanik law that still applies because of their practices against the emigration, particularly of Soviet Jews. I understand the origin of that law, and I understand what needs to change in order for Russia to be able to join the World Trade Organization. But I'll tell you this, the best thing that Russia can do in order to be able to enter the international trade regime is to clean up their abuses in their own country, to make it clear that they respect the rule of law, that business people will be protected under the rule of law and certainly not imprisoned and tortured, as Mr. Khodorkovsky has been. We don't want to see that type of conduct. And if Russia would do that, if they would reform their systems, then I think we'd be a long way towards that type of integration into trade.
I thank my colleague from Maryland for an eloquent statement about